those of you in the community who may be watching, this session is being recorded. And today's policy subcommittee meeting is going to pertain to 4 policies related to the reopening of the schools on September 16th. The general policy around COVID-19, policy on remote learning, policy on immunizations, and the policy on face masks. We were also originally slated to discuss the policy on harassment, but in terms of timeline, that one's a little less pressing than the 4 policies around the reopening. My hope is that this committee will be able to refer to the full school committee those 4 policies so that we can further discuss them with the full committee at this evening's meeting with an eye toward a second reading and full approval on the 14th. So having provided that by way of introduction, have the committee members had an opportunity to review the most recent drafts?
Yes, I have.
Yes, I have.
All right, so we can begin with the COVID-19 policy. Jennifer, do you have any further thoughts on the second version?
So I believe in this section, and I'm sorry that I don't have the document in front of me, but I went through them all last night. We had talked about changing the word client to students, and I believe it's several pages back, maybe under special education.
I recall that, yeah, so we'll make that change.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there anything else?
No, everything that we discussed was reflected in the revised draft.
All right, Andy?
Yeah, hold on, I'm looking through the document now. I had a question about the attendance section. I noticed that since the last time we discussed that you had struck out the phrase "and accommodations" for students requiring special placements.
Yes, my understanding from our discussion was, I believe Jennifer brought up that it was confusing to include that language in there. Do you think that should be back in? Or?
Well, I guess you're right, I am confused. We certainly don't want to be suspending accommodations, right? That's not the intent at all. However, it might make sense to modify or adapt some procedures related to those accommodations. Right, and we don't want to exclude that possibility. I mean, some services might have to be delivered in a different format. Perhaps Casey can tell me whether I'm making any sense here. Like we don't want to suspend accommodations, but the superintendent might need to modify how those accommodations are given.
Correct. I'm just trying to find it in the document, the language.
Yeah, it's sort of near the bottom of the second page of the current draft under a bullet called attendance. And you're right, it's strange that it's under a heading attendance. It
right.
Seems not to belong there. But.
And that just to, while Casey's looking for that, just to sort of revisit why I brought that up yesterday was because I didn't understand why it was under attendance, and also, you know, we want to be specific about why we might and what kinds of changes we might make to accommodations. It just seemed like a strange place to put that information.
Okay, so you don't object to giving the superintendent the ability to modify those policies, simply that it's in the wrong place in this document.
Right. I think Jennifer was right in that when we talk about student accommodations, we're often thinking about an IEP or a 504 plan. And so to put it under this makes it seem as though, like, I think Andy is what you're saying, that we don't want to suggest that we're not going to follow them. And right. So I think we had made the decision to strike it entirely because if it's in an IEP or a 504, that a student's attendance, that the attendance policy would have to be modified in order for the student to access school or the curriculum, we would be doing that anyways, and that we don't need to put it specifically in this policy. So it wouldn't bar us from still continuing with our typical practice, which is to follow any modifications to attendance for a student anyways. This would just avoid any potential confusion because of the word accommodation.
Okay.
That was my recollection, Jennifer.
Yes, and I agree with
Yeah,
you.
I just think it would, go ahead.
Jen.
Oh. I was just going to say, yes, I agree. I just wanted to make sure that we were protecting student accommodations and also allowing ourselves the ability, but we go through the IEP process to make changes to accommodations in these situations anyway. So I just don't see why it's here. And I think that it leaves a lot open to interpretation that I don't think we want to do. I think in this way, we preserve best student accommodations as needed and leave that under the IEP process specifically. I just didn't understand how it was connected to attendance.
Okay, so it's part of the IEP process that will remain unchanged unless we say something, which we're not going to do.
And to change any 504 accommodations, it would be,
Yeah.
you know, it would be through a meeting
Okay,
there too.
sure.
Yep.
Well, that's fine.
All right, so if everyone is okay with this now, I would like to move that we recommend the COVID-19 general policy to the full school committee. I'm sorry, go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, sorry, there was one other thing. I'm still going through the document. So under illness and contact tracing, I think this is something we had talked about, and I thought that we might also add notification to contact tracing because those are kind of different processes that might involve different definitions of contact. I don't remember where the discussion ended up. I just noticed that there wasn't any mention of that, even though we had talked about it. Do you think that we need some kind of policy about notifying that's distinct from the contact tracing?
I think
So
the other
David-
night you suggested that the word would be will, not may, in that document.
Yeah, I saw that and I was going to bring up the will. I guess shall serves a similar purpose instead of may. I thought will was stronger, but I would defer to the chair's discretion. If they feel like, do you feel, David, that shall is strong enough on that particular item?
We can make it will. I see it essentially very similar. I just put it as shall because that was the construction in most of the other paragraphs, but we can make it will. That's fine.
Yeah, I think I'm okay with either as long as the direction is that it should be done, not might be done. And Andy, what was there? So there, I feel like there were two, the discussion about the disseminating information, like a notification. I
Exactly.
mean, I feel really strongly that we should be notifying families. So if this is the place to put that in, I think maybe we should, I don't know how we word that. I don't know if that's a procedure. I don't know where that falls. Is that policy? Is it procedure? But I think that we've heard indications that that would be the plan, but policy is our place where we can set what our expectations are. So David, where would that belong and how could we word that?
So we could add another sentence to that same paragraph about notice. Andy, do you have some proposed language for that or sentence to add there? Or
I mean,
anyone
so after the word COVID-19, you could add something like "and for notifying." Others who may have come into contact with. I don't know. I hadn't thought through the language because I wasn't sure whether we intended to address it at all, right? I mean, just at my understanding, there's been some concern, right, from Jennifer in school committee meetings, and I think from members of the community that people who aren't part of the contact tracing network, but who would probably have a good reason to want to know about a suspected case, are not automatically going to be notified.
And so dovetailing off of what's the language you proposed, so after COVID-19, that paragraph, and for notifying others who may have come into contact with a person testing positive. Is that sufficient?
Yeah, I think that would address it. What do you think, Jennifer?
Yeah, I don't know if we want to, I'm not sure how we would word it because I would, my thought process was anyone working in close proximity. So like classmates and classroom teachers, but also any sort of service providers who may be providing pull-out services or children in those, I'm not sure how I don't know. I'm not sure exactly how we would word it to make sure that we get notice to, maybe the general notice is sufficient. Notice anyone to provide notice. And maybe we need to say something about confidentiality, like following the rules of confidentiality, but peers or contacts that may not be close contacts, but just contacts of anyone with confirmed, a confirmed case of COVID-19 would be notified for informational purposes or something like. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how that would go.
I guess to help somebody reading this. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, that's the Zoom danger.
Yeah.
Establish protocols, including notification of identified close contacts, and we probably want to go further than that. Close contacts and necessary school personnel.
Maybe just contacts instead of close contacts, because close contacts follow the definition of contact tracing strictly with DPH guidelines. So I think we want to make it more like contacts or something that's more general.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if we should just add a sentence making our intent clear, which is that it may be the case that the circle of people who ought to be notified is broader than the circle of people who get who get contact traced, right?
I know that is the intent that we have. I guess my question is similar to Jennifer. Should that be policy or procedure?
Mm-hmm.
And it gets tricky because of the confidentiality piece. So I'm not sure of the answer there.
So the very next sentence in that same paragraph says that such protocols will be consistent with law and regulation and standards to protect the privacy of students. So that's already covered. I think what we want to refine here is the language about notification. Now, at least to me, in Andy's construction, and for notifying others who may have come into contact, it's pretty broad.
Right, so we're just asking the superintendent to develop a protocol which will presumably define that circle of people. We obviously don't need to define it ourselves.
Right. Right, so I think that's sufficient as it's worded, because this is just describing what we want the superintendent to further develop.
Okay.
All right.
Can you read back the language of that addition, David?
So that full paragraph is illness and contact tracing. Subject to the provisions of the back-to-school plan, the superintendent shall establish protocols for tracking student contacts as a means of locating others from whom students may contract or expose other persons to COVID-19, and for notifying others who may have come into contact with a person testing positive.
Is it possible, do you think, to say in that notifying others who may not be considered close contacts? Just to differentiate the difference between someone who might be considered close contact, and maybe we even put close contact in like, oh my goodness, my brain really hurts, quotation marks. I don't know, I'm just trying to define, like, explain, so if people read this policy, understand that there is contact tracing for contacts, and we're talking about a notification for other contacts that may not be strictly covered under the definition.
Notification of appropriate school community. And just for one thing, it's illness and contact tracing, not contract tracing.
Yes. So do you really think we should get into that we would also communicate notifications to people who are beyond close contacts? Just to me, that seems to be getting a little detailed for policy when we're just saying that the superintendent will develop procedures, will develop protocols.
I like the original language that doesn't specify.
Right.
Yes.
That would be my preference as well.
Do you feel that the language, all right, maybe just read it back one more time and I'll be comfortable with it. I just want to make sure when we say contact tracing, that's very specific language for only people who are considered close contacts. I just want to make sure that we're gathering that it's also just contacts of people.
Okay. Subject to the provisions of the back-to-school plan, the superintendent shall establish protocols for tracking student contacts as a means of locating others from whom students may contract or expose other persons to COVID-19, and for notifying others who may have come into contact with a person testing positive. Who may have come into contact
Okay.
is pretty broad, so I think that covers your concern, Jennifer.
Yep, no, I'm good with that.
All right, any other comments on the policy as a whole, or are we ready to vote to refer this to full school committee subject to changing the word clients to students and this language that Andy drafted for this paragraph that was just read?
I'm willing to make a motion.
A second.
Okay, so let's vote. So Jennifer,
Yes?
Andy,
Yes.
and I vote yes as well. All right. So now we can move on to the remote learning policy. All right, so Jennifer, was there anything that, this did not have as many edits to it.
I am just arriving at my central location. I do not believe, if you would take Andy first, I could review my notes. But I do not believe I have anything. If it is, it's minor.
All right, Andy?
Yeah, I'm very brief. I actually don't have any more comments on this one. It seems fine to me as it's written.
Casey? All set on this
No,
one?
no comments. Yep, I scanned it. Thank you.
All right, Tricia?
No comments.
All right, so are we ready to vote to refer this one?
Yeah, David, the only thing that I'm thinking, I'm going to run upstairs and just double check it. In one of the documents, we have the wording the COVID-19 instead of COVID-19. And I just can't remember what policy that was in.
So that was when we just voted, but we can
One or
take
not, but-
the out. I'm not too worried about that. So that's fine.
Well, I'm not sure.
Looks like Jennifer just froze on us. We don't have to vote on this one right away, but we could move on to the next policy and then vote for remote learning afterwards. All right. So next up is immunizations. Now offline, I had a discussion with Tricia that we have an existing policy on immunizations that is much lengthier, and it specifies specifically which vaccinations, which shots we are looking for students to provide evidence of. So I think that this policy is intended as an addendum, not as a replacement. This was drafted by or at least the base version of this policy was drafted by the MASC in August, and I think they're just looking to cover COVID-19 related issues by it.
David, I'm sorry. I was a little distracted there for a minute. The policy on remote learning, that's the one we were just talking about, right? A minute ago?
Yes.
That's the place where it says clients on the second page instead of students. That's that document.
Okay, so that is that one. All right.
And then do we want to make a motion on it?
Sure, I was just waiting a little bit for you before voting on it. Okay, let's
Thank
make a
you.
motion now.
Yeah.
All right, so we can make that motion subject
I'll
to that
second.
change. Okay,
Yes.
Jennifer? Andy?
Yes.
I also vote yes. All right, so back to immunization of students. So I was mentioning, Jennifer, that Tricia and I had an offline conversation about this, where we currently have a policy in place for immunizations. It's far more detailed, and it specifies specifically what types of immunizations and vaccines we're looking for students to take. So my understanding from the MASC is that they intend for this to be an addendum. It does not actually mention COVID-19 anywhere in it, so I'm not entirely sure why this is needed, but
Yeah, there doesn't seem to be anything here that's COVID related.
right.
All right.
The only thing I would say about the policy that exists is it's lengthier, it's very old, and the immunizations that are delineated are not, it's not accurate anymore. So I think sometimes listing them is a little bit of a detriment. So maybe not even including, but just to say those that are required. The first statement, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts mandates in its school immunization law, MGL 76, that no child, unless exempt for health or religious reasons, shall be admitted to school without a physician's certificate stating that they've been immunized against. And it lists the diseases, but I would probably just say according to the requirements, because there are more than what are listed.
Is it DPH that sets the requirements that we follow?
Yes,
And they're the only agency that does so?
correct.
Okay.
All right, well, because we did not really look at that draft, the current policy as a committee, I don't think we should move on that at this time. But given that this current draft does not really address anything specific to COVID-19, I'm not really seeing why we would need to approve a modified policy in time for the start of the school year. So I think this is something that we can revisit at a subsequent meeting. We don't necessarily have to refer this to the full committee. It seems like it's less pressing. Are you comfortable with that, Andy?
Yes.
How about you, Jennifer?
Yes, I would just say, since we're in the work of it, if we could pick this up at a subsequent meeting and sort of maybe, since we're trying to update many of our policies and we've done some discussion on this, perhaps we could revisit this soon and update this policy in general, especially because there are some new vaccine, like new requirements, like the flu vaccine for this year, that it just might be timely for us to review the policy in general and get public feedback on it and just go ahead and update it either way.
Yes, I agree. We can take this up at our next meeting as well. All right, so we will put that on hold for purposes of today. So we can now move on to face masks. Now,
So,
yeah. Go ahead, Andy.
Oh, well, no, go ahead and say what you were going to say before I
was going to say that the two main issues that we discussed at the last policy meeting around the initial draft, Jennifer had articulated some concerns about certain types of face coverings and whether they should be prohibited. So I added language that prohibits it. And this language that I added actually comes straight out of an advisory that already went out from Ms. Laham on September 4th to the school community. So this is incorporating some of that language. And then sort of the other issue we were dealing with was who it is who can provide exemptions. There had been some robust discussion around whether it should be MDs only, whether it should include mental health professionals. I ended up consulting with some other doctors as well as members of Panel 4 who have been meeting regularly to discuss these issues. And Panel 4 felt very strongly that we should be more restrictive, not less, and that this should not be expanded to cover mental health professionals. They did express an understanding around potential access issues for seeing physicians on a timely basis, but they felt that on an interim basis, an NP or an RN might be okay because they also deal with these issues, and sometimes patients are seeing their nurse practitioner with more regularity than their physician. So that's why the language has been changed to what's reflected in the revised draft.
Can I go back 1 minute to the gaiters, bandanas? We did say in our letter that went out that masks with bells were prohibited, and we were discouraging gaiters and the other. Are you going to make the statement that we are prohibiting them?
Andy, Jennifer, what do you think? Should they be prohibited or just discouraged?
I'm actually about to find out by Googling for the first time what a gaiter is.
I think and I think it's G-A-I-T-R, I think is the,
Yeah.
have a typo in there, but I mean, I'm leaning towards yes. I think that they should be, unless somebody's got a compelling reason for why they shouldn't.
Is the problem with them the material they're made from, or the shape that they have?
I think it's a combination of things. Like I said, I'm not a medical professional, but I think that they're not as secured, right? Because they don't loop over the ears. Kids tend to play with them a lot. And then there is a concern over the actual fabric and whether there were some studies done this summer about the efficacy of different kinds of masks, and they were rated much lower than different kinds of masks, like cloth masks or these kinds of masks, and obviously N95. So they were rated much lower, and I think for a number of reasons it might be reasonable. I just think there's not enough of a compelling reason for me yet to say that we should let kids have them. There's so many other reasons why not to do it.
I agree with you, Jennifer. Any other thoughts on this about prohibition on gaiters?
I will say the reason I had originally written that we would discourage is because something is better than nothing. We know that to be true. And if there are students for whom this is what they can and will wear, I think maybe that's the reason for discouraging versus prohibiting.
So given that we're going to have face masks available for students who do not have some other type of covering, I'm not particularly concerned about that. So I think we should go ahead and prohibit them. And we're going to have further public comments on this both today. I see that we have a few participants, a few attendees, and also we'll have 2 full school committee meetings where there will be an opportunity for public comment before this policy will be implemented. So I'm inclined to leave this as is, as prohibited.
I would just add also that there are some materials in the studies that I've seen that I think I was trying to explain yesterday or the day before when we last met, that there's some materials that seem to actually encourage dispersal of aerosols. I'm not sure how we want to talk about it, or droplets, because they actually are meant to be breathable fabrics. And so they actually let things pass through the fabric more so. They break apart larger droplets into smaller droplets that might just fall or stay in the mask. So I do, for all of those reasons, I would keep the language that we have, pending more input, public comment, full school committee debate.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. Like, just prohibit it unless somebody offers up a really, really good reason to not prohibit it.
All right, so the next revision was basically the allowing NPs and RNs on an interim basis to provide the exemption. Are we comfortable with advancing that language?
Is this, did you say this was after consultation with some physicians, and was this also in consultation with panel 4?
Yes, this was in consultation with 2 physicians as well as panel 4. And they would be happy to join in and participate on this at an upcoming meeting. So I could have them, they might be present for tonight's school committee meeting when we're going to discuss all this again. They could also be present on the day that we actually vote this on the 14th. So they've expressed a lot of interest in opining. So they'll be available.
I am okay, at this time, I'm okay with the language.
Yeah, I mean, I'm okay with advancing this, yeah, since it's not a final vote.
The one other issue I want to bring up that I spoke with Tricia about offline was the allowance of having masks and face coverings off while outside. Tricia expressed, and I agree with her, that we don't want a blanket allowance for masks to be off outside, because if students are not appropriately socially distanced, then that's still going to be a problem, whether indoors or outdoors. So I think I would suggest that the bullet that says "while outside," which is the fourth bullet, while outside a at 6 feet or greater social distance, would that be sufficient? Or what would you suggest, Tricia?
I'm not even sure if I would have it there as a standalone, because all the other times that you could have it off while either or drinking, while taking staggered mask breaks. I don't know that it needs to be there at all.
Yeah, I think actually that's a good point. I think it might create more confusion and more sort of like, well, when outside can you and when outside you can't, since it's not a blanket anytime you're outside and there are specific rules around that. I think we would have to start delineating that in the policy. And I don't think that we need to, and maybe we just don't need to put it out there, because if students are within the school day and they're outside, they're going to be instructed by who are the adults supervising them about what is appropriate, because I think there will be times when students are outside that it's not appropriate to take the mask off versus a mask break or some specific activity. So I think actually maybe taking it out is okay with me.
All right, I'm fine with taking it out. Andy, are you okay with taking it out?
It seems fine. I mean, by now the rule in Brookline, I believe, is you're supposed to have your mask on, you know, when walking outside anyway, right? So I don't see why this needs to be any different.
I do actually, oh, Andy, were you done? I don't want to interrupt you.
No, yes, please.
I just actually am been wondering, since we met, what are the certain activities in PE classes where you would be allowed to take a mask off, Tricia? I was just curious what that might be. I wasn't sure.
I suppose it would have to be very well defined. You're far apart. I mean, I don't know. I feel like most physical activity classes, you're busy, you're expending energy, you're probably breathing harder, a more chance for having some secretions. So I'm not quite sure when that would be.
Is anyone going to be swimming? No.
No, I don't even think that the pool at BHS will be open.
Okay.
I know Desi has had some guidance, Jennifer, about PE and masks. I think if it's indoors, you have to have a mask on, and if it's outdoors, you have to have X number of feet in order for masks to be off.
So maybe we either we think about taking it out, or we think about adding in certain activities in physical education classes with appropriate physical distancing, or some sort of, it's not just anytime you're in PE and it's not up. I don't know, I think we just need to be a little bit more prescriptive about what would those sort of set of circumstances be that we would allow masks to be off during PE, especially because kids are probably breathing heavier, right, if they're doing exercise. And so you've got a stronger force of air coming from the lungs. So I just, probably even more of a reason to have masks unless people are outdoors. Maybe we say certain activities, certain outdoor activities in physical education classes with appropriate social distancing or something like that.
So does the policy need to cover extracurricular athletics as well as PE classes, or is that just outside the scope here? As it's written, it's
it's anything on school grounds.
Worn by all individuals in school buildings, on school grounds, and on school transportation. So that that I guess takes in extracurricular sports, right? But that there's a whole separate guidance on that from Desi, or there will be, or from somebody higher up. So anyway, can we just leave that out altogether, or do we need to somehow incorporate it?
That's a good question. I don't know. David, do you know?
I'm not quite sure I follow the question. So the question's about this entire section or specific to?
This whole entire policy, or it says, yeah, well, but with special application to this section, and above, right, like the policy is supposed to apply anytime somebody is on school grounds.
Yes.
Which includes extracurricular sports, right? And so as it's currently written, that's not an occasion for any kind of, you know, right to take your mask off, because it's not in a PE class, even though it may be exactly the same type of activity.
Okay, so we could add that during certain outdoor activities in physical education classes or extracurricular activities. Would that cover it?
Well, who
Yeah, or
decides?
in physical education classes or extracurricular athletics.
I think that the other thing we need to think about is, well, two things. One, who decides what extracurricular activities that are outdoors get to have their masks off? Like, I need to think about that a little more. And then the other piece is, in the second paragraph, it says school buildings, school grounds, school transportation. But if athletics or extracurricular were to occur and you were not on school grounds and you might be, I don't know, I'm going to make this up, practicing at Lars Anderson, or you were in another town with a scrimmage or something. I mean, we haven't gotten there on athletics yet. We're not there yet. But that wouldn't be covered necessarily if, according to our language. So I don't know if we add it or we put extracurricular activities to the side because we don't, at the time, because we don't know what's going to happen, or if we include them and think ahead.
Well, I think to Andy's point, I mean, if you're playing basketball in gym class or playing basketball after school, it's essentially the same activity, and that wouldn't currently be covered. So I agree that we should add extracurricular athletics to that line. In terms of whether this would apply when at other schools and in other towns, that's a little more complicated because other towns are going to have their policies. And I think that piece of it would require further research. I'm not sure, though, that I would want that one relatively narrow scenario to tie up having a face mask policy in time for the start of school.
No, I think though, I feel like we've had other conversations and things that are like, that schools, if you think about it, maybe Casey could help us. When we think about like the bullying policy, anytime that a student is involved in a school-sponsored activity, I believe we're responsible for sort of those guidelines. So maybe it's as simple as adding in on school grounds and school transportation, or on school sponsor or at school sponsored activities. And it's just sort of general like that, because
Okay. So where would,
I think that would cover it.
Where would you suggest we add that to?
In the second paragraph, we have must be worn by all individuals in school buildings, on school grounds, and on school transportation, and at school-sponsored activities. And it's open-ended, and that covers athletics. And then we say in the bullet points at the bottom, during certain outdoor activities in physical education classes or extracurricular activities. And that leaves it open to whether it's athletics or a coding club, like whatever that extracurricular activity is. It could be a multitude of areas, and it's general, but it covers it all.
Jennifer, do you need to
Going
add
back
the
to that
word?
second paragraph, was it at school-sponsored activities, you said, or events?
I think activities is more inclusive than events, because an event could be like a one-time presentation, whereas an activity is a more involved, hands-on thing. And Andy, what was your question?
Oh, I noticed when you were talking then about the change to the bullet point, you said during certain outdoor activities, which is not how it is right now. Do you mean to restrict it to outdoor activities?
Oh, yes, I thought we had talked about that already. I'm sorry. I thought we were going to add outdoor, because you can't take your mask off indoors for PE at all anyways.
Oh, you can't. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, so I'm happy with that. So what Jennifer said, change the second paragraph and then add to the bullet point physical education classes or extracurricular athletics.
Can we make it activities instead of extracurricular athletics, so that it includes other kinds of clubs or groups?
Okay.
I don't know, maybe we don't want to do that. Maybe we want it to be specific to athletics.
Activities is fine because, like you said, that's a more broader designation that will encompass pretty much anything that's school related that's occurring outdoors.
Oh, and then we were going to add, I'm sorry, during certain outdoor activities and physical education, extracurricular, with appropriate social distancing.
So that one actually is already in there in the
Oh, it
preface.
did.
So
Yes.
before the bullet point says when appropriate social distancing is enforced.
Yes.
All of them apply to that.
Thank you.
Now, one other point that Andy had brought up at the last meeting was about the scenario where there's a teacher who's alone in his or her classroom and would want to be able to remove the mask. My thought is that can sort of come into the first bullet point where we say that there will be strict protocols to be laid out in detail by the superintendent. So I think that can come in there as maybe an exception, because other than these first 10 days, or once we're back in sort of the regular swing of things with school, I don't think they're going to be teachers in empty classrooms the whole day. And I would rather that there be mask wearing as a default. So I think that portion can be explained in the protocols that we are asking the superintendent to come up with in consultation with Tricia. Is that sufficient, Andy, or would you like a specific item on this?
I think that's fine. So you really are envisioning that like no one can have it off for more than 5 minutes, regardless of.
My thinking is just as this policy lays out certain exceptions to face mask coverings, the protocols to be laid out in detail by the superintendent could also include an exception to the 5-minute mask breaks.
Yeah.
And detail what that would be.
That's fine.
All right, any other thoughts on this policy?
I just have a minor change of wording in the paragraph about who gets to grant exemptions, where it says parents. Can we say parents or guardians may not excuse their child from the requirement?
Okay.
Yes, that sounds great.
All right. Any other thoughts on this policy? Any other proposed changes? All right, so the corrections that we want to make before voting on this. So I would like to move that we recommend that we refer this policy to the full school committee subject to the following changes. First one was the spelling error of Gators. So we spell that correctly, Gaitors. Then
I think it's TERS actually.
TERS. Okay. GAITERS. Okay. So that'd be one change. Then the next change, parents and guardians. So we have that language. And then the bullet point that currently says during certain activities of physical education classes will now read during certain outdoor activities in physical education classes or extracurricular activities. Oh, we also had one other change, I'm sorry.
I think in the second paragraph.
Right, the second paragraph, instead of all individuals in school buildings, on school grounds, and on school transportation, even such distancing is observed, we add, so in school buildings, on school grounds, on school transportation, or on school and at school-sponsored activities, even when social distancing is observed. So subject to those edits that we have just outlined, are we? Do we have a second to referral? Okay, Jennifer, seconds.
Sorry, there was one other edit, David.
Okay.
That we were removing the bullet that says while outside, right?
Oh, that's right. Sorry, we removed while outside. That's right. Okay, so now are we ready with those 5 changes?
Yes, and I still second the motion with those changes.
All right, Jennifer,
Yes?
Andy,
Yes.
and I vote yes. Okay, so I mentioned at the beginning of this meeting that the harassment policy, we're going to need to merge various existing policies as well as a draft. So that's going to take some more time. It's not as pressing as these other policies we're reviewing today. So I would recommend that we refer that to a subsequent meeting, but not too far off in the future. We're going to pick right back up on that, along with the immunizations policies. We'll be working further on those two. Right now, I would like to check whether any of our attendees would like to make public comments or offer their thoughts. Please raise your hands if you do. All right, I don't see any hands going up. So next we have new business. Is there any new business? No, nothing?
You know, the one thing that I do think we might have to wait for more of this conversation until after we do school committee goals, but I would like us to think about what the policy subcommittee goals are and how those goals can support the work of the school committee goals. So I do want us to take some time. I know we're doing some urgent policies, and we have 2 policies on the table that I think are timely and in their own ways urgent that we need to revisit. But I would also like us to think about like long-term goals for ourselves for the year as soon as that's appropriate.
Okay. Any other thoughts? All right, in that case, that concludes our meeting. This was nice and quick, but that was sort of the intent. We're looking to, I don't think it's a good practice for us to be voting to refer policies on the very first time we discuss them. So that was the original thinking behind scheduling this second meeting. It also provided more of an opportunity for members of the community to opine on some of these policies. It allowed me to reach out to Panel 4 and talk to them. So it was helpful being able to sort of have this double meeting. So that concludes today, and we're going to be discussing these policies again with the full school committee later in the evening. So see you later, everyone.